I think we'll start now, and we'll, people who are not here will catch up and they can come in later on. So we'll have the three panelists talking now, and we will carry on with a chat. People can put in, raise their hands, I think, and some of the panelists can answer, and the panelists can talk amongst themselves. But we'll start with Nadia from Italy, because that's where the crisis came, and then we'll have Andreu from Spain, from the Spanish state, and Christine from France. I mean, just a couple of words of introduction as well. I mean, the crisis is a health crisis, a pandemic which arises out of globalized neoliberalism, which is destructing the ecology of the planet with its agribusiness, disrespect for nature, huge urban densities, and a globalized system of production and travel, which has meant this pandemic has gone across the world much faster than anywhere else. But the other thing that is particularly evident for us here in Britain is how the neoliberal governments have been complacent in dealing with the crisis. They certainly did put, first of all, maintaining that the economy remains open rather than public health. And once again, as we've been saying, as anti-capitalists, as socialists, as revolutionaries, that they've been putting profit before people and the planet. And obviously, as you will see, myself and the three other panelists are from Europe, but we're not ignoring the fact that this is a worldwide pandemic. It's arisen in advanced capitalist countries in Europe, originally from China, but Europe and the United States now, but it's spreading to Africa, the Asian continent, elsewhere in the Asian continent, and that's what we've got to remember. It's also a global pandemic, and we need to extend our solidarity to those comrades and populations that are facing the same threat that we are facing now. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. The panelists will speak for 12 minutes or so, something like that, 15 minutes at the most, and then we'll open it up for discussion, chats, and so on. So Nadia, up to you.
Thank you. Hello to everyone. Of course, I'm not a native speaker, so I apologize if I can't find some words or say strange words, half Italian, half English, but I'll try to manage. So, yes, I opened this conference because, in fact, Italy is still one of the most affected countries by Covid-19. I'll give you some numbers. So actually we have had more than 160,000 people infected and more than 20,000 deaths and 37,000 people recovered. So that makes a huge amount of people concerned. But the incredible thing is that these numbers, which we all wait for at every night when the television gives us the new numbers, they are completely unreliable because, in fact, they depend on the tests that are being done, which are completely insufficient. And so actually independent researchers are saying that the real contagion may be 5 to 10 times more than the numbers we are getting on television. And also the deaths are probably 2 or 3 times more, because even these are not measured. There are no sufficient tests in the healthcare houses, for example, or people dying at their homes. So the numbers we get are absolutely unreliable, and that's not by chance. I mean, it's a deliberate politics not to give the dimension of the pandemic that is going on. So at the same time, this situation comes not totally unexpectedly, but the government has been totally unprepared to cope with the situation, not only conjuncturally. I mean, they have reacted too late on the plan of security measures, and reacting by the so-called social distanciation politics. But there is the structural problem, which is not only existing in Italy, of course, but I think in the rest of the world, in the rest of Europe, certainly, especially in the southern countries, and that is the neoliberal politics that have dismantled the National Health Service during the last 20 years. Just to give a real number, we had a diminution of the beds in the in hospitals, especially for the intensive care units. They were double as much 20 years ago, and with the privatization politics of the neoliberal governments, we are at the situation we are in now, where there isn't enough beds in the intensive care units. The situation is especially horrifying in the health sector for the staff, for the medical staff. We have had more than 100 doctors, especially the ones that work as a general practitioners, who have died because they didn't have enough masks and other protection material to protect them. And the same situation is, it's even worse in care homes and for other medical staff. So that is a result of the politics that has been carried on in the last 20 years, and I think Italy is no exception for that. Now, so the government reacted too late, and with unreliable and contradictory information and measures, and charging the population with or accusing the population of the contagion. And this is really revolting, because they are so we have this police control and ideological attack on people who are doing sports, on individuals, on children that play in the courtyards, whereas at the same time there is no control on the production, on the industries that keep on producing, keep in activity, without the necessary protection measures for their workers. On that, there have been strikes going on, and due to the depression of the trade unions and the workers itself, that have often gone in spontaneous strikes, at the end, a number of industries have been closed down, have been locked down, but still far less than that is usual. And it's quite obvious that it's the most industrialized part of the country, Lombardy, which is the most affected by the crisis. Now, I will stop describing the situation, because I want to come to some conclusions, and we can talk further later. You can ask me questions about the situation. The fact is that the general climate in Italy is of supporting the government, which is trying to cope with the situation. But at the same time, the socio-economical situation is about to explode. So I don't think it will last much longer. The popularity of Conte, of the premier, will last much longer, because many families are not are not able to buy even the necessary food to get to the end of the month. There have been economical measures to support the poorest layers of society, but they are absolutely insufficient. There have been some revolts in some places in Italy, especially in the south, people entering the supermarkets and getting what they need to eat. But at the same time, there's a big, let's say, solidarity and assistance coming from the church and from other NGOs to try to support the poorest layers of society. Now, as one of the lessons, one of the conclusions, I think we can see in this situation, first of all, is that the COVID crisis simply puts a light on situations of inequality already existing in society. It only exacerbates them. The inequality that exists in access to housing, to education, to healthcare, all these social contrasts are now coming to a much more radicalized situation, and contradictions that are present in society, in capitalist society, in patriarchal society, and now become more visible and tend to explode in this situation of crisis. I refer, for example, to the fact that the priority of our neoliberal society is put on producing mostly unnecessary and harmful commodities, whereas now it is clear that what we need in society is healthcare, is education, is social services, and this means that the people are more aware of the fact that this should be the center of our society, of our world, of our producing, caring for the essential things in life. And I think that is what we should, as revolutionaries, as ecologists, and as feminists, this is what we should work on, taking advantage of this crisis to underline that this society is not corresponding to the essential needs of the people, and that we want a world where these activities and the people who work on this should be the center, should be well paid and valorized. And women, of course, are especially concerned in what I'm saying. So I think I will stop now and come back later.
Great, thank you very much, Nadia. That was very informative. We already have one question. I don't know if it's a general question, but we can come back to it later. From Dave Kellaway, he asked, there's been lots of speculation about the political consequences of the pandemic. Once the pandemic eases, are we likely to see a radicalization to the left or to the right, or neither? Anyway, you started answering, giving a little bit of an idea of which way we should be going, but maybe we can come back to that later. Anyway, our next speaker is Andreu from Anticapitalistas in Barcelona. So Andreu,
evening.
All over to you.
Good evening, comrades. I'll just try and focus on the specificities of the Spanish state, or the Spanish case. As you know about the pandemic itself, it seems to be on the downturn of the curve of infections, but as yesterday many workers had to go back to their jobs, we can't discard a new upturn at some stage. On the other hand, as you may know, the figures are around 18,000 dead, but nevertheless, it seems that the rhythm of infections is decreasing. So hopefully it will continue. There's been a massive impact in the care homes of elder people. That has been a real slaughter, and that has to do with the lack of staff and big business by private companies that are subsidized by the state and give a terrible service, as we've been able to see these days. Obviously, everywhere else, people's main concerns are more or less the same, but here it's mortgages and rent, reinforcement of the health system that has been severely weakened in the last 10 years by cuts and austerity measures, jobs and minimum income. According to the IMF, Spain will lose around 8% of the GDP, and probably unemployment will reach around 20% in 2020. On the other hand, of course, safety at work is a very important demand, and obviously we do demand to stop industry and the building industry, something that the current government has only accepted just for the Easter holidays, in fact. So what are in my view, the main concerns for the left? On the one hand, I think authoritarianism, because in a way there's been a prominence of army and police during the state of alarm. And this has in a way changed the view of ordinary peoples of the role of the repressive forces in all the political spectrum. On the other hand, there's been many arrests and fines for breaking confinements, and this leads to legitimize the delation and even electronic surveillance. There's a debate around this in Spain, as there is in other countries. And obviously, this is a global dynamic too, but here the state of exception will always try to replace the ordinary rule in terms of public order and state repression. In addition, in the Spanish case, this adds up to the known as Ley Mordaza, the gag law that was passed by Rajoy to repress the mobilizations against cuts and austerity measures in the last decade. So on the other hand, we have nationalism too, in a way, like we've seen in France with Macron. This constant appeals to be waging a war, which obviously is as the likes of the military that turn up in the press conferences. On the other hand, and this is, I think, is very similar to the Italian case, we have a political atmosphere of acceptance of politics of lesser evil, and the rise of the far right. As you know, currently we have Unidas Podemos has joined the Sanchez PSOE government, losing most of its political autonomy with respect to the PSOE, in a similar manner as Rifondazione Comunista in Italy that joined Prodi's second government in 2006, which has been a catastrophe, I think, for the Italian left. And in a way, this has closed the cycle of massive repoliticization and mobilization since the Indignados revolt in 2011. And it's also arrived 5 years later after the election of Alexis Tsipras in Greece, which was also a catastrophe for the left and has put the left in Europe on the defensive and has led to further demoralization and a leap in the far right and the right-wing populism in the whole of the continent. Nevertheless, this is the first coalition government since the Second Republic, and unfortunately, the main difference with that time is that the Labour movement is on the retreat. And in fact, the right wing is on the offensive due to the rise of Vox, which is a split on the far right of the PP. So they have, the right has a great margin of maneuver and a great impact on the whole of the political spectrum. Unfortunately, Vox puts a lot of pressure on the PP and also on Ciudadanos. So in a way, the government appears in a way to defend the status quo, and it's the far right that appears as anti-systemic and as the main anti-systemic force, following a bit the French and the Italian path, unfortunately. So in a way, there's a socialization of the logic of the lesser evil to this panic a right or a right government supported by the far right. So in this context, PSOE is recently talking about the need for massive consensus, a kind of new version of the Pactos de la Moncloa, which were signed at the end of the dictatorship during the political transition after Franquism. And the PSOE is agitating around this idea to counter, in a way, the prospect of a strong corporate pressure in favor of a great coalition between the Socialist Party and the right and the PP around a basic neoliberal consensus, and to exclude Podemos from the executive. But what were, very briefly, these Pactos de la Moncloa? They were an agreement, a broad agreement of the main parties in the transition to stop inflation at the time under the impact of the world crisis, and to consolidate democracy in this turmoil of the time. But nowadays, we don't have a massive inflation to stop. The main problem, the main political problem, is state debt and also massive private debt. Unfortunately, this kind of social agreements always defeat the left. So here, the only important battle that the Unidos Podemos in the government is waging right now is the battle around a basic income. But as we have known today in the press, that measure has been postponed by the executive for the following months. And who knows if this will eventually appear or not on the agenda. Just to conclude around the main tasks and the main campaigns for the anti-capitalist left in this conjuncture, in my view. In the first place, I think we must help to build a social and political front against a new neoliberal consensus, whatever the formula is, around this so-called re-edition of the Moncloa Pacts of 1977, a massive investment in the health system, of course, and radical fiscal reform, because the main problem in all the economies nowadays is debt, and this obviously will have a massive leap, unknown in history. And I think one of the key issues is also nationalization of the pharmaceutical industry. And last but not least, I think we must put forward the need for a massive energy transition, given the fact that the coronavirus crisis has a lot to do with global warming, ecological crisis, and it won't be the single sanitary crisis that will live globally. So fighting global warming and ecological crisis is key for the future. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Andreu. There's loads more questions coming in. I mean, I think you can answer them yourselves if you want, but we can come back to them later on. Lots of people have signed in now. We're nearly full. And so our next speaker is not very far from us in France, from the New Anticapitalist Party, Christine Poupin, who will also talk along the same lines as Andreu and Nadia. Christine?
Okay. So good evening to everybody. For beginning, well, according to official figures, there are nearly 15,000 deaths in France. 2/3 are in hospital and 1 in nursing homes. It seems that the number of deaths is stabilizing and even slightly decreasing, but well, it's not yet sure. Nearly 32,000 people are still in hospital, including near 7,000 in intensive care services. Well, yesterday evening, Macron makes his 3rd speech since March 6th. 16, that was the beginning of the lockdown. Lockdown means closure of schools, colleges, faculties, markets and business, which are not said essential, prohibition of all gatherings, strict limitation of the right to be outside the home, and fine. But at the same time, there is strong, very strong pressure from the employer and also from the, well, economic ministry to make the work going on in factories and in construction and things like that. Well, so yesterday Macron announces that the lockdown will continue until May 11th, and he says himself that he and his government have no other policies than to extend the lockdown. He said, and I quote, "This is the only way to further slow the spread of the virus and to find available resuscitation places." Well, they have, in fact, no other solution because of the destruction of the public health services and because of the lack of anticipation. So they go on with the confinement, well, what we can say by default. And in concrete terms, lockdown means that the entire burden of prevention efforts are on the populations. Well, but in 4 weeks, because it will remain for 4 weeks, Macron promises the gradual reopening of nurseries and primary and secondary schools, but not universities, which will not reopen before the summer. So the student will stay at home until September, maybe, but the youngest children will be the first to go back to school. Well, obviously it's for them that it will be the most difficult to respect what they call social distancing. In fact, well, everyone can see that this reopening of schools for the youngest children is simply the condition for sending their parents back to work, regardless of the health situation. And this decision is causing a lot of anxiety and anger, especially, but not only among the teachers. And actually, it indicates the priority given to restarting the economy rather than health. It's the exact opposite, we can say, of our slogan, our lives are worth more than their profits, what we say. Well, I want to stress that the country was totally unprepared for the pandemic. And there are several reasons for this lack of preparation. The first one, of course, concerns the health and social welfare system. Well, unless the social protection system in France was one of the most developed in the Western world, and with the reform imposed by the workers' movement after the Second World War. But even if equality in face of illness was never perfect, it was a major achievement. And this achievement has been undermined over years to give private insurances a growing role. Well, the French health model was not perfect, of course, far from it, but its hospital system was one of the strongest in the world. But for the 30 last years, it has come under regular attack in the name of accounting discipline. I don't know if it's the right word, as if an hospital has to be run like a business. And well, we can say that more than 50,000 beds have been closed, including intensive care. And today, well, the whole lockdown policy aimed not exceeding the resuscitation capacity. Well, but that's not the only lack of preparation. Every day there is a shortage of masks, protective suits, hydroalcoholic gels, but also of test resuscitation equipment. And this is quite incomprehensible and ununderstandable when we know that in 29 there were nearly 1 billion surgical masks and 700 million respiratory masks. In reality, it's not only the masks that have disappeared, it's the idea itself of what it means to be prepared for the crisis that has simply disappeared within the state. The COVID is part of repetition of pandemic over the last 20 years, and the World Health Organization decided to focus its activities health risk and to encourage states to prepare for a serious pandemic. And that's what was done by the French state, preparing to manage a serious pandemic with strategic stocks, large budget, and so on. For example, it was decided to finance a French mask manufacturer so as not to depend on uncertain importation. Well, and it's all this preparation, all this experience, all this know-how that has been cancelled. And it's not giving to a conspiracy theory to say that. It's simply noting that the practical effect of neoliberal fundamentalism, for which dormant public money represents absolute evil, the violation of dogma and mask, medical equipment is dormant public money. The neoliberal ideology of competition at any price, the short term, the effacement of the state in front of the necessary, more efficient market guides every political decision, even when the crisis is there, and even now it's at work today, prohibiting any effective policy for the supplies and production of necessary material. So Macron and his ministers lies to cover up their policy, putting the population and the most vulnerable people at risk. Nothing is ready to face the pandemic. They say it's just a big flu. Masks are missing. They say they are neither necessary nor efficient. And today, when there are not enough tests to prepare the end of the lockdown by testing, well, they decide it's just useful to test only people with symptoms, while the WHO says test everybody. Well, so despite, well, the words about the heroism of caregivers, about the central role of the hospital, we have no illusion about any change in policy. And the conclusion of Macron's speech yesterday, well, I quote, "We will have better day and we will have happy day again." Well, this sentence sounds as a provocation because it's the title of the National Council of Resistance program after the Second World War. So, well, and everything indicates that far from social change in the government's policy, well, we have to prepare for hardening of the policy. And today, the emergency health law allows derogation from the labor code by allowing working weeks up to 70 hours. There is give to capitalists, which are increasing. There is repression and police violences in working class suburbs. Well, just to say some words about the reaction, there are several initiatives to prepare for the future. There is also organizing concrete solidarity. Maybe the most significant appeal is called Never Again, and let us prepare for the day after, which is from 18 leaders of trade unions, association, and environmental organization, which address to all progressive and humanist forces. Well, that's quite a very important convergence between trade union and environmental association. Well, this has begun at on the climate issue, but it's something very positive, while the dominant trade union movement was rather marked by a certain productivism, we can say. Well, it's there is also a petition with 4 immediate demands. Well, the cessation stop of activities which are not essential to respond to the epidemic, the requisition of private medical institutions and companies to produce mass respirators and all what is necessary for life-saving. The immediate suspension of payment of dividends and bonuses for the CIO. And also the targeting of the 750 billion euro injected by the European Central Bank only towards the social and ecological needs of the population. Well, of course, obviously, well, to rebuild what the 18 people affirming this declaration say rebuilding together a future ecological, feminist, and social. Well, it's necessary, obviously, to go far beyond this immediate measure, and questioning the capitalist system in all its dimension of exploitation of workers, appropriation of social reproduction, destruction of what we call nature. Well, it's necessary to ask the question of expropriation of capitalist group of health, pharmacy, energy, banking, insurance, and of building real common area that put at the center the care of human and of the so-called nature. Well, the question now is what will happen with the social movement. We had a lot of strong social movement before the pandemic. The confidence in the government is very low. Well, it's quite obvious that they are always lying and not very efficient. But, well, it's quite difficult to know what will happen when we will stop this time of being separate. And maybe the most difficult is that people will have done very different experiences during this time, between people being inside their home, quite alone, quite in individual situation, and with people, well, on the front, and with a lot of work and in difficult condition. I think that's, well, a challenge very important to rebuild unity around that. Okay, and for the rest, I agree, of course, with the measures proposed by my other comrades. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine. It's great to hear from comrades from elsewhere in Europe. A lot of things in common with us here in Britain. Gives us ideas for the sorts of axes of resistance and programs of demands, we have in common about renationalizing public health, the privatized public health, bringing into public ownership big pharma, etc., protection of labor rights, and so on. And I think Andreu made a good point about normalization of repression. Getting people used to seeing lots of police on the streets, which obviously in a dangerous situation we're now in, is obviously important to make sure people don't infect others. However, we must also fight for civil liberties and not go back to or not allow our governments to repress. So I'm not quite sure for the audience, for the attendees, if you can raise a blue hand if you want to speak, but otherwise in the meantime I'll read out a couple of the questions and the panelists can come back in. I mean, Liam from London asks, how do the comrades think the pandemic is affecting class consciousness in their countries? That's one thing. A question, a more general question about Europe, right, which is a long one from Mike in London as well. I'll read it out. Much of the analysis of the crisis has focused on the role of the ruling class in individual nation states. It's a global crisis. So what can we conclude from the weak response of the neoliberal transnational organizations, the UN, the European Union, the IMF, World Bank, etc.? Are there any positive examples where a subnational part of the state has responded differently? You know, local government councils, etc. And what lessons, particularly, are those councils, etc., organized by left-wing forces? And finally, what lessons can we learn from the situation for struggles around other global crises, especially the climate crisis? Some of that you've answered already. I'll just take another one here from Mark from Mark in Brighton. I have read that the situation of the countries in the global south is potentially much worse than in the north because of the impossibility of self-isolation, the very poor health systems in these countries, etc. There would be hundreds of thousands or hundreds of millions of cases and many millions of deaths. How should we act on this? What demands are posed? Will we actually be effective? Okay, so apologies if I can't take questions from the floor, so to speak, live questions. Maybe I've set it up wrong, so, but if somebody wants to put a chat in to tell me how to do it, I'll do that. So maybe I can go back to the panelists. Did you hear the questions, Nadia, Andreu, Christine? Is that, do you want to each come back a little bit on for a couple of minutes on these questions? Nadia again.
Yes, I don't remember the four of them, but maybe you can repeat them later. How the pandemic will influence the class consciousness? It's, of course, it's difficult and contradictory and depends on the subjective factor, who is active, who is having agency in this situation. For example, in the region of Bergamo, which was the most affected by the pandemic, which is a real industrial part of Lombardy, the trade unions have been very active in contrasting the authorities and the bosses union to stop the production in non-essential sectors. And I think there's a very big class consciousness in that region due to the fact the workers are very much exposed to big risks with people dying and well, every family in Bergamo has people who are directly affected, and they know, of course, directly on their own skin that who are the responsibles for this. So in this sort of situation, I think there's anger is really rising, class anger is rising. It's a contradictory because of course the authorities are trying to get the opposite result, trying, as I said before, to not to talk about collective responsibilities or political responsibilities, but trying to put things in terms of individual responsibility and even yeah, how do you say it, making people denounce neighbors and other citizens who would be the cause of the contagion because they are individually acting in one way or another. So there's this very frightening reaction also of a part of the population that directs its frustration against other people, other neighbors, people who are not the responsibles, of course, of this crisis, and which creates a climate of suspicion and certainly not of solidarity. So you have these two parts. You have one part of the population which is increasingly angry with and politically also conscious of what's going on. Of course, that depends, as I said, a lot on who is actively intervening politically and socially in this situation. I must say there's something, there's one actor here in Italy which has not exactly my sympathy, but I must say that he's having a big role in this situation, and I'm talking about the Pope Francis, who has been really active in Italy, at least. And I must say, in a quite positive way, he has asked for a universal income, for example, for everyone. And also he is talking about charity, but in a very universal sense of, for example, solidarity with the migrants, with the people sans papier, without documents, with the people who are drowning in the Mediterranean Sea and for whom the Italian government has been closing ports again with the excuse of contagion. So, well, of course, the Pope, for me as a feminist, remains the enemy for many things, for the fundamental reproductive rights and for women and the LGBT people. So I'm not especially a fan of the Pope, but I must say that in this situation, he has been more to the left than many political parties, most of political parties in Italy.
Okay, can we leave it there, and I'll take
yes.
Andreu and Christine briefly on, if you can remember the questions, maybe the European Union and international organizations. I mean, Andreu, do you want to, and the Global South, do you want to say something about that, Andreu?
Yeah, well, just a couple of remarks. I think one of the main contradictions we can see nowadays is the crisis in the European Union, basically because, or in any, all the main crises that have that the EU has had to lead with have been very destructive in the last 10 years, starting with the debt crisis with the southern countries, Greece, Italy, Spain, and so on. Continuing with the migrant crisis, I think that nowadays the lack of solidarity with the countries that have been mainly affected by the pandemic has been quite obvious. And this last agreement that they reached a few days ago I think is very provisional, and all the problems will raise again in the foreseeable future. So I think this this pandemic is sort of polarizing all the contradictions. And of course, the main problem is this despotic nature of the bureaucracy in Brussels, and the structural uneven development in the European Union. And I think that it's not a very feasible structure without radical change, unifying fiscal systems and inventing mechanisms of redistribution of wealth among richer and poorer regions. About class consciousness, I think that this crisis, in a way, has made a lot more obvious the nature of neoliberal and austerity measures, because the peoples are paying with thousands of deaths, the cuts and all the austerity measures that we've been suffering for the last 10 years, at least, and maybe even the 40 last years with the implementation of neoliberal measures. And it's been quite obvious in many countries that their profits come before our lives, because it's most of the governments have tried to stop wherever blocking of productive activity, and this is also making quite obvious that value comes from productive activities rather than financial speculation. So I think it does help to develop a more sort of anti-capitalist approach, and the fact that we're at home, we have time to think and to read and to get informed is positive. The only problem is, and the main difference with a general strike is that we're isolated and in a way, and there's not this sort of collective dynamic of leap of consciousness. But I really think that some problems have become a lot more obvious. And I think Terry was posing the question of the impact on women and migrants. And of course, I think it becomes obvious too that the more vulnerable groups in society are a lot more precarious now, when everything is sort of at a halt. And I think Roger, a comrade called Roger, was asking me directly about the question of basic income. I've never been very enthusiastic about it myself, but and I've always been I've put more emphasis on the need of having totally free basic needs covered and social services, and putting the emphasis on radical reduction of working day as a sort of more anti-capitalist measures. But obviously don't oppose the demand for this measure. But I think that the previous ones I was talking about are more coherent with our sort of more global anti-capitalist goals. And just to finish, I really think that there's the impact of the pandemic is quite proportionate to the impact of the cuts and neoliberal measures in the different countries.
Right, thank you. Christine, do you want to say any comments you want to make now?
Well, just I think we have to be very, very cautious about what is going to happen, because of course for us it's the crisis, the pandemic makes more obvious that the capitalist system is not able to face the catastrophe, to face a pandemic, but also climate change or things like that. But what is very difficult to know is well, what will be and what will do the fear for people themselves and for their parents or children, and the blackmail about employment, which is obviously going to be very, very important. And for instance, we see that already with people going on working in plants for production, which is not useful, not immediately useful, but well, the question of employment will be very, very strong. So I think that, as Andreu say, that the question of the reduction of work is very, very, very important. I think it has to be central. Well, I don't know. Well, I want to hope that we are in a better situation to have the discussion about what production are useful and which have to be suppressed. But because we make the experience of things which stop, and we make the experience of what is absolutely useful. Well, but well, I think in theory we are in a better situation, but it's quite very difficult to know what will be the impact of something so important, which changed so much the life. What we can say also is that we have the experience of changing. The life today is very different from what it was, well, some weeks before. So it's possible to change, but the path we have to do is to say, well, we can have change that we decide. The life is not obliged to be the same as it has always been. It can change, but it can change on our collective decision. I think we should work on how to explain that, how to make this very, very concrete. Well, it's I have a lot of questions about it, because we have very few places to know what are the reactive, the collective reaction, the collective thinking about all of that. And of course, we have a lot of things on social networks, but we have to remember that it's always something very partial and very, which is not the reality. It's just a very small part.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll read the three other questions there, but I think there's a possibility for people to raise their hands to talk, and then I can allow you to talk. So I'm not going to shut up anybody, but if you can work out how to raise your hand by your name, then I can click on something that says allow to talk. But in the meantime, I'll read three other questions. I was going to start with Terry's because it's Andreu's started answering it. The panelists can also see the questions, and obviously, the question from Terry from London is, can you say more about the particular impact of C-19 crisis on women and on migrants? And can you say what role your organizations are playing in any solidarity movements with the most excluded during this crisis? And there's one from Andrew Bergin, who asked, how do we build an international left response to confront this pandemic and the economic crisis? Each country in the European Union is retreating to nationalism, as Christine says. Do the panelists think that we should work for a new Zimmerwald conference to unify all those on the left to fight for a truly international response to these events? And then there's Alex Lee, he says, the need for strong trade unions is really obvious during this crisis to defend workers' health and safety and fight for welfare and basic income. Christine mentioned that in France, the trade unions have been partnering with NGOs on their campaigns. Could we hear a bit more about what trade unions have been doing in Italy and Spain? So there you are. So, so actually somebody's put their hands up. So maybe the panelists can remember those three questions, and I'll take James Hatfield now. Maybe James, you can speak for a couple of minutes. James, go ahead.
Yep.
Can't hear you, James, sorry.
Okay, yes. I was just following up with some web links. So there's like Eco-Socialist Horizons webpage, and peacenews.info, Nexus news feed.
You're cracking up. We can't hear you very well, James.
I was just saying, there's lots of good websites out there. The peacenews.info, lowimpact.org, Green Left Blogspot, Common Dreams, and Nexus Newsfeed.
Okay, all right. Thanks, then. So so there's other websites which can look at, and of course, Socialist Resistance and International Viewpoints are good websites to go to. So in the meantime, Andreu, do you want to talk about the trade unions in Spain, what they've been doing, if anything?
Well, unfortunately, they're quite compromised with the new government, you see, because actually some of the ministers are very linked to trade union bureaucracy. So there hasn't been a very significant opposition of at least of the trade union leaderships. However, there has been some opposition of the left-wing unionists to this lifting of this confinement for industrial workers that started yesterday. And this has been quite important among, as I say, left-wing unionism. But as I say, the main unions are sort of being very compromised with Unidas Podemos especially, and they're very linked to the executive. So all the main reactions that we've seen in some of the factories have been very spontaneous and sort of wildcat strikes against their leaderships, but with no significant backing by the leaderships. It is true that nonetheless some leaders have criticized very recently some of these measures of returning to work, but very timidly, as I say. Unfortunately, one of the main problems is the weakness of the labour movement in general. This explains a great deal of the situation we've got.
Do you want to say anything about Andrew's question about international left response? Is there, how are there any ideas floating around in terms of linking up with other forces across Europe?
Well, we've recently been discussing some initiatives, and for instance, there has been some, I think, some examples of international solidarity, like the role of the Cuban doctors in many countries, and this is a real lesson, I think, for the arrogance of many imperialist countries that have been unable, having a massive GDP, to sort of face this situation. And a country like Cuba, that's a very modest country in economic terms, has this massive role in supporting foreign countries, I think is a real example. And I think we really have to support their role. And for instance, one of the main demands now is to insist on the need to lift the blockade on Cuba, and the sanctions on Venezuela, which are criminal, because, and also Iran, because these countries aren't able to have a supply of medical equipment, and I think this is directly criminal in this situation. So obviously, we must think in developing internationalist initiatives, but there is a very big danger of this sort of nationalist turn in most of the countries that we've seen this sort of response all over the place, especially where the right wing is in power, of course, US and especially, but also other countries.
Great. Okay, Nadia, do you want to say anything on Terry's question about? Well, you started talking about migrants, how the government's repressing migrants, but I mean, in terms of the crisis of how C19 is impacting on crisis on women, and what solidarity movements exist.
Yeah, well, hi Terry, on the question, the impact on women, of course, is very strong in many dimensions, many fields. When one of them is that many of the people, the workers who are on the front line battling against COVID are women workers, are nurses, are doctors, are healthcare people, are women working in care centers for elderly people, cleaners, family assistants, I don't know how do you call them in English, especially many migrant women working in private homes. So on that side, women are particularly on the front line of reacting to this COVID disease and being affected directly, but also struggling against it as caregivers, and also in the families itself, of course. And at the other hand, and as we know, this sort of work is not appreciated, not paid for, not considered important in the capitalist and patriarchal ideology. At the same time, the isolation inside the homes, of course, has another aspect. At once, the ideology says that the home is the safest place, but of course we know that the home for many women is not the safest place, but on the contrary, is a place where there's a lot of violence. And in this crisis, the domestic violence is peaking, is getting very worse than ever. So that is another aspect which is not so visible, but on which women's and feminist organizations are reacting a lot, because even with the social isolation, but the NGOs and feminist organizations are reacting with telephone lines and inventing new ways of giving support for women who are in women and LGBT people who are in a situation of domestic violence. So it's important to say that the feminist movement that has been very active in our countries in the last 4 years, with a new generation taking the lead, has not demobilized during the pandemic, but is still finding ways to meet, of course, by on social media, and to do some actions, flash mobs on the balconies, and other ways of still being active in this very difficult period. So of course it's not easy, and I agree with Christine when she says it's difficult to see what the reaction will be in the day after. And I think it's very important what she said, what is happening in France with this platforms of social movement activists and trade union activists of different sorts, who are already positioning themselves on the day after on this never again platform. I think it's a very, very good example. Nothing like that is yet happening in Italy. And I come back on the trade unions also. Unfortunately, in Italy, the trade unions have only had a defensive role against the offensive of the workers, of the bosses' organizations, and they have only insisted to sit down with the government and the work and the Confindustria, the bosses' organization, to try to limit the list of activities that were considered essential and to defend on a very basic level workers of getting infected. So, but there is no more political reaction of any big organization. So the reaction what comrades are doing is on a rather small scale, building solidarity with migrants, what I told about the feminist movement and things like this. Also assuring immediate aid in very popular neighborhoods where situation is getting very difficult. So mutual aid, solidarity initiatives, this sort of thing.
Thank you. Christine, a couple of minutes on the trade unions, because you were involved in Sud Trade Union, an important union in France, and I saw you nodding when or reacting about Andrew Bergen's comment about an international, some sort of international conference to unify the left.
No, what I can say is that we have planned European meeting, eco-socialist meeting for the last weekend of June. And of course, it will not be in with physical presence, but comrades from Switzerland who organized this meeting, well, decided to maintain a date to meet and to try to have an international conference. I think it will be, well, it's a date, and obviously it will not be only on climate change, because it was planned on climate change, but of course it will be also about the pandemic. Well, I think it's, well, that's the first occasion for an European, not worldwide, but European meeting. I think it's quite important. So well, just about women, I want to say two things. Well, obviously, well, I agree obviously with all what Nadia says on how women are on the front line of the COVID. But well, two things. First, about abortion, we had we need to have a mobilization about abortion, because the access is much more difficult, and so we have to expand the use of chemical or medical, not well, with well, chemical abortion, and not theoretical one. And the change of the dates, well, which are longer, to allow women to access abortion. And the second thing I wanted to say is that well, obviously the situation at home is very, very difficult for a lot of women, but what we can say is how well, Me Too and Neonamenos and the movement has changes the thing in France, because the issue of domestic violence was something quite taboo, something which was not public, which nobody speaks about that. And now, during the crisis, with the confinement, well, it's something quite obvious that there is a problem with domestic violence. Well, so somewhere it's, well, the things are going on. Well, but the situation is very, very difficult, because the concrete solidarity to allow women to leave the dangerous place where they live with their husband, or not husband, but violent man, is much more difficult. But I think the climate has changed. We can measure how the climate has changed about that.
Thank you. In fact, on this appeal by trade unionists and others, it would be good if you can send us the link so we can share it in Britain. The appeal.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Now we have got a comrade from Colombia who wants to talk. Cesar from Colombia. He wants to talk about. I met Cesar when he was in London, so he wants to talk about his country, what's happening there. Cesar, it's yours now. You can talk.
Hello, Fred.
Yeah, speak. Go ahead.
You hear me?
You're live now.
Hello. How are you?
Good.
Hello to all the comrades as well.
You can
Some
put
of
the
you
camera
may-
on as well if you want. Yes.
Okay, I will try. Yeah, I don't have the option here.
Doesn't matter. Go ahead and talk to the.
Okay, yeah. Thank you to the panelists. I've been following very close the situation as well in Europe, as I used to live there. And most of my family live there in Spain and the part in London. So I've been following there. And I'm living here like for the last 4 years in Colombia. And from here, looking at the situation in Europe is like looking at the future. Yeah, because here just the thing is starting now. Yeah, so so I want to say just a few numbers, a few figures to see how it's happening here. So, for example, in Colombia now, the number of contagion or total cases of contagions or infected people is less than 30,000 people. Yeah, and 112 deaths. Yeah, which is a very low number of deaths. But there is a thing that in the related to the infected people, that there are not enough tests that the government are making here. So we really don't know what are the possible real number of infected people. So everyone expects that is much more than this less than 3,000 people that the figure shows. Anyway, apparently the government took a few early measures to prevent the early contagions in the first stage. So I think it was a good point at the moment. So it's been delaying the what they say the curve, but now they have no control on the infected people, and there is a second phase going on, which is mitigation. And you can imagine here the system is really poor, as neoliberalism is the main thing, or has been the main thing for the last 1500 years here. Normally in normal situation before the pandemic, the health system was collapsed. So you can imagine how it's now. So it's important to understand that the government is putting a lot of money into private health companies, and it's forced the whole people of doctors and nurses is forcing them to be available to work. Yeah, as the main narrative is on war. Yeah, this is we are fighting a war. You may know probably that recently in 2016 a peace accord was signed between the government, the previous government, and the former guerrilla FARC. And the implementation of these peace accords has been very difficult under this government. And now with this pandemic, with this situation, a lot of achievement has been reversed now. So we are kind of really worried because of this. Everything is in standby, but except the violence, except assassinations of social leaders and former members of the guerrilla that they demobilized like a few years ago. So the situation is about only in 2020 there has been around 72 social leaders killed, and 21 former guerrilla members killed as well, just in 2020. Last year was was horrible as well in this thing. So the targets for them are really easy now because everyone is confined. Yeah, so they are at home. So how can I say, like, the dark forces looking and kill these social leaders and unionists as well, and former guerrilla members. For them, it's really easy to find them because they are at home. Yeah? So this is what is happening in terms of violence and peace building here. Let's say that these measures has been quite effective, but of course, economy here as well is quite fragile, and most of the population is live in day by day making money. I don't know if it's working in English. But this is many of the people here, especially in cities. So a lot of them are forced to be confined at home. So they are putting like red cloth in their windows, showing that they have no money, no food to eat, but they cannot go out to work to get money to buy this food. So it's been a really social crisis in this aspect as well. Yeah. Plus, there are some helps in terms of money that the government has supposedly give to the low-income people has been robbed as well, as in the middle of the corruption thing. So there's the good thing about this crisis, we can say that it's showing a lot of failure in the system and in the government. Lots of people, I think, regarding to the previous question about social classes awareness, I think a lot of people is taking this kind of awareness as their role in society, because there's a new policy or a new idea from the government that they're saying that we are going to try an intelligent confinement, which means like most of the people as possible, and companies try to keep their workers working from home, and the others should be they will have to go to work and put their lives in risk and their health in risk, which is majority of the people, which actually they don't have stable jobs and stable incomes. So it will be a lot of people, majority of the people, and let's say like very low working classes and lower classes as well. So yeah, they will kind of receive all this the contagion of the virus. Yeah. So this is exactly what we expect to happen, that poor people is going to be more at risk, and of course this society will sacrifice them in the name of the economy.
Thank you. Okay, thanks a lot, Cesar. Hello again, and thanks for coming in. We've been going on now for an hour and a half. It's great to hear from outside of Europe. Just one thing, it reminded me, there is one thing now that we can do in terms of solidarity, is campaigning to cancel the debt. Cancel the debt is even more key now in terms of the debt to the third world. But maybe Andreu, Christine, Nadia, you want to come back and say for a couple of minutes, if there's anything you haven't covered. I know Nadia wants to come back on something. Nadia, do you want to come back for a couple of minutes while the others think about what they want to say?
Yes, because the question of migrants, I think that's one of the other contradictions, which is so evident now, because in Italy as well as in Spain, there are thousands of illegal migrants working in terrible conditions in agriculture. Normally, they are seasonal labor. They move from one place to another where they go and collect food, and now of course they can't do this. So it's so obvious for everyone that these are the essential activities. Agriculture is absolutely essential for life, for society, and it's now landowners are now complaining terribly because they can't get laborers. And even the Minister of Agriculture is now saying that about hundreds and thousands of migrant workers should get their legal contracts because it's absolutely necessary that they come back and work. Or else we won't have enough food produced in Italy, enough vegetables and fruit. So once again, it's what this crisis does is show what the essential activities are and who is doing them in terms also of race and gender. And I think that's very important. As for the direct solidarity with migrants, the NGOs are continuing to do a very good job. So they are very radical and anti-capitalist, anti-racist NGOs who are doing an excellent job. But of course, it's not enough to give an answer which should be a structural answer to the problem of migrants and refugees.
Right, thank you. Andreu, do you want to say something?
Yeah, just a couple of remarks, because I think one of the comrades was posing the question of housing and in this crisis, and this is a big subject in Spain, because since the big recession, of course, there's been loads of people have lost their homes and so on, and it's still a major problem because you have the mixture of a very powerful financial banking system in Spain that has many privileges in respects all the mortgage laws that are draconian in Spain, particularly draconian in Spain, where you can lose your house and you can even have to keep paying your debt, even if the bank recovers the house because of the mortgage, an unpaid mortgage. And also there's the impact of tourism, because as you know, Spain has a great deal of dependence on tourism for the GDP and the main income. So in big cities like Barcelona, for instance, the price of rent is absolutely ludicrous. I mean, it's like Florence or maybe even Venice. I mean, it's absolutely ludicrous. So this is a very big issue in the left. And one of the main social movements that's had a very important role here for the last 10 years mainly has been the platform of people affected by the mortgage, and they've been very active, demanding the cancelling of the paying of mortgages, and also a new social movement, the Union of Rent Payers, and they've posted also the demand to cancel payments of rent. And I think this is a very important issue that the government is tackling in a very particular way to avoid confrontation with banks mainly. Although it is true that they have put down to 50% the payment of mortgages and rent for owners that own over 10 buildings, 10 properties. But this obviously only affects very big business, not many owners of flats in big towns. So this is a very important issue.
Right, thank you very much. Christine, a couple of concluding comments. unmute. I'll unmute you. No? No?
Sorry, my microphone was cut. No, we have also something about not paying the rent for houses, and also in Paris you have something about requisition of R&B, which is also a big problem because it make the rent rise very, very high. So we have some appeals about that. Well, and well, about migrant, what we can say is that well, there is a lot of NGO who are and people and who are going on doing a lot of very, very big job because a lot of official and social services doesn't work anymore. So people have to do things like that. And well, it's always something very amazing, the number of people who are able to act concretely.
Great. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you for everybody for having attended and staying on for an hour and a half. I thought it was a great meeting to hear about what other comrades are organizing and thinking elsewhere in Europe to show that we're not on our own and that we need to have an internationalist, eco-socialist, feminist, anti-racist and socialist perspective on all these things. Just a couple of announcements briefly. We talked a bit about the Global South, and Another Europe is Possible is having an event on Saturday online as well on neoliberalism, democracy and COVID-19 in the Global South with comrades from South Africa, Egypt, Brazil, etc. So go on to their website, Another Europe is Possible. Socialist Resistance online, check it out. We got stuff up there every day or every other day, and on our website you can put your email and you will get an occasional newsletter as well. And also we are all supporters or members of the Fourth International, so you can read online the magazine at International Viewpoint. And just another international event, just to remind comrades what Christine was saying about the conference, the Eco-Socialist Conference on the last Saturday in June. It will be online, and obviously the subject will be more than just eco-socialism, but it's a European conference. I think the link to the conference has gone on the chat, but we can forward that as well. And finally, our next meeting will be in 2 weeks' time, so it's same time, same channel, as the saying used to be. In 2 weeks' time, the 28th, and it's going to be on the United States, Bernie Sanders and what's going on there with Dan Labots from the New Politics website and Joanna Misnik from Solidarity, and both active in the Sanders campaign. So that should be a fascinating thing. So thanks everybody for being here. Thanks Christine, Nadia and Andreu again. See you after all this. And we'll save the chat and we'll post the video. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Oh, yeah, four, yes. So,
ciao.
Ciao.
Leave meeting.